Fa Mulan.
Present.
Speaking without permission.
Oops.
Too skinny. Not good for bearing sons. Recite the final admonition. Well?
Fulfill your duties calmly and respectfully. Reflect before you snack. Act. This shall bring you honor and glory.
Now, pour the tea. To please your future in-laws, you must demonstrate a sense of dignity and refinement. You must also be poised.
Pardon me.
And silent.
Could I just take that back for a moment?
Why, you clumsy!
I think it's going well, don't you?
Put it out! Put it out! Put it out! You are a disgrace! You may look like a bride, but you will never bring your family honor!
Grandma was wrong. It was not going well. All of her notes, all of her family's preparation, even that lucky cricket can't help Mulan impress that matchmaker. The pressure was really on for this to go well, and Mulan fails. Not only does she come away from her trip to the matchmaker without a potential husband, but her not being married is viewed as a personal defect, one that reflects poorly on her entire family. For her community and culture, Mulan's singleness is a huge problem. It will end her family line. She will be without the security and future a husband and family would provide, and the honor of her family is jeopardized. Mulan's worth, at least to the matchmaker, is tied to how well she can get a husband. And based on what happens here, Mulan comes up lacking. And while we aren't generally thinking about our family honor or lineages today, singleness can still feel very much like a personal deficiency. The feelings of disappointment, of doubt, and loneliness are very real, and they can be deeply painful. It's easy to look at all of the happy couples and engagements and weddings and feel like you're just coming up short. And certainly our own culture, our families and our friends and the church have not really helped the idea that singleness is somehow a lack or a deficiency. There are more songs, TV shows, and movies than I could possibly name that obsess over being in a romantic relationship. And many a sitcom would be lost if they could not focus on the shenanigans of trying to get a date. Much of our media world is filled with pictures of dating and marriage, and as such, we're inundated with the idea of being in a relationship constantly. Singleness, on the other hand, is portrayed as something boring or lacking or just bad. And it makes every minute we have to spend on our own feel like we're missing out on something grand, magical. Our lives might be okay before we find a significant other, but things really get started after we have that special someone, or at least that's what we're told. Our friends and families might have been pushing this idea on us as well. In middle and high school, I remember being told, Megan, it's great that you're so smart, but that's really gonna intimidate boys. I know there's a lot of issues with that statement, but one of the most insidious was the idea that it mattered more that I be able to get a boyfriend than be comfortable with who I am. And that my worth was to be found in a romantic relationship, and I needed to bend my very personality to get that. We get all kinds of messages from people we spend time with about the relative value of singleness to dating or marriage. And it may be that we have unintentionally trained ourselves and those around us that singleness just isn't worth as much, that the time and energy of a single person is less valuable because they're not spending it on a spouse or on children. And those of us who aren't single anymore might be guilty of furthering some of those messages, communicating to our single friends that they have a problem that needs to be fixed, or giving advice that isn't helpful or wanted. Church culture might be one of the worst culprits, though, as many modern American churches have no idea how to interact with single adults. They might have wonderful children's ministry and youth groups and resources for families, but not know what to do with that in-between group that has gone off to college or work, but isn't necessarily in a family of their own yet. Marriage and family have been held up in Christian culture as part of the foundation of a good Christian life. And those who aren't there tend to get left behind. I remember the phrase ring by spring being thrown around a lot in my high school youth group. Mostly joking, but definitely with the hope that that was gonna happen soon for us. And now my youth group was awesome and generally did a great job at talking about relationships. But looking back, it feels like we talked a lot more about how awesome it would be to be in a relationship and how we were going to act once we were there, and not as much about how we were going to live our lives as single people. And I can't imagine I was the only one with that experience. And with all this, it's no wonder that we're set up to view singleness as a personal deficiency or as some sort of purgatory-like state that we need to rush out of as fast as we humanly can. Much of what we've been told about romantic relationships and singleness has conditioned us to devalue singleness and to overemphasize dating and marriage. Many of us have never been given the perspective or the tools needed to value singleness and to live well as single people. And this is especially detrimental considering that all of us are single at some point. Not everyone has kids, not everyone gets married, not even everyone dates, but pretty much all of us are single for at least some amount of time. And knowing that, it matters quite a bit that we learn to value singleness, to view it as more than a sign of something lacking or an unfortunate phase before we move on to better things. In fact, we need to start seeing and valuing singleness as something that reflects the love of God to the world in a truly beautiful way. But to get us to that kind of radical shift in how we view singleness, it helps to see how singleness was viewed by the early church and how that view has changed pretty dramatically over time. At its start, Christianity was actually much better to singles than the other religions and cultural practices of the time. In Jesus' day, Hebrew culture was very similar to what we saw in Mulan, in how heavily marriage and family was emphasized. Singleness was not a real life option for people. Someone remaining unmarried well into adulthood would have been viewed as someone who is not fully formed or fully realized. Marriage and having children would have been a person's source of security, prosperity, and their legacy for the future. To not be married would be seen as pitiful or even suspicious, and the community around the single person would be wondering what was wrong with them or with their family that they had remained unmarried. In this way, marriage was steadily made into something like an idol, something people would seek and put their security and hope in that wasn't God. And if we're being really honest, this isn't too different from how many of us view a romantic relationship today. This became a problem for the Israelites, and it becomes a problem for us when we put our hope and trust into a relationship with one person rather than with God. So we have a culture where singleness is looked upon negatively and marriage and family are put on a pedestal. And then we have Jesus, a single adult preaching and ministering with authority, just shaking that system up. And a single adult man would have already been weird, but a single adult rabbi was pretty wild for that time. And this is not someone we could say was less than fully realized or incomplete. This was Jesus, the most perfect and whole person, God in the form of a man. With this, we could never again say that singleness is a sign of being less, because Jesus himself was single. And after Jesus, we also have the example of Paul, who was quite vocal about his singleness and his preference for single life. At the very beginnings of Christianity, we have prominent examples of adult singleness. Here, it was not a problem that needed to be fixed, but a viable and sometimes even preferable way of living life. In early churches, singleness was actually the overemphasized state, with married couples having to sit in the back of church. Now, the solution to our problems is not to go back to that, but instead we need to learn to view singleness and marriage more equally. Paul does voice his preference for single life, but he also writes beautiful passages on marriage and family. And he speaks into the balance between the two in 1 Corinthians. Because of the present crisis, I think it is best to remain as you are. If you have a wife, do not seek to end the marriage. If you do not have a wife, do not seek to get married. But if you do get married, it is not a sin. And if a young woman gets married, it is not a sin. However, those who get married at this time will have troubles, and I'm trying to spare you those problems. But let me say this, dear brothers and sisters, the time that remains is very short. So from now on, those with wives should not focus only on their marriage. Those who weep or rejoice or who buy things should not be absorbed by their weeping or their joy or their possessions. Those who use the things of the world should not become attached to them, for this world as we know it will soon pass away. Here, Paul puts both marriage and singleness into their place. One is not better than the other, and we don't need to feel like we have to rush from singleness into marriage. We can value both without becoming overly invested in one or the other. Author Tim Keller puts it this way. Paul says it means that both being married and not being married are good conditions to be in. We should neither be overly elated by getting married nor overly disappointed by not doing so, because Christ is the only spouse that can truly fulfill us, and God's family the only family that will truly embrace and satisfy us. Over time, church culture has moved towards holding up marriage and family as pinnacles of Christian life, something that God doles out when we do a good job or act the right way. Viewing marriage this way is a mistake, as it sets up romantic relationships as a reward for our works, and our goal as Christians to be married and have kids, rather than to love God and to show God's love to the world in every circumstance. God is the only one who can truly satisfy us, and our true worth is found in God loving us and pursuing us even in our brokenness and sin. To put any other relationship in place of God is to set it up as an idol. And in doing so, we will put an impossible pressure on our romantic relationships to fulfill us in a way they never can. Paul tells us not to be absorbed by what our relational status is, but rather to turn that focus towards the one who can truly fulfill us. The reality is that the gospel de-idolizes marriage. When we look at the early church's view of singleness and Paul's leveling of singleness and marriage, we see the fruit of a worldview that doesn't put its security in marriage and having children. Early Christians choosing to forego marriage were in making a huge statement by choosing not to have a family, choosing instead to place their trust and security in God. Their hope was in the kingdom of God rather than in a legacy of their family line, and their earthly security was found in the community that God had given them. Our ultimate inheritance is in God and the fullness of God's kingdom. Our lives as Christ followers point towards this as our greatest hope. And none of this is to say that marriage isn't important or valuable, because it absolutely is. That any relationship we have is not an end to itself, but is intended to point to our truest, deepest relationship with God. Our love for others as single people, as friends, in dating relationships, in marriage, and as parents are all reflections of our God who is love. We love each other because God loved us first. In general, romantic relationships have been overly focused on and glorified in our culture. And we have to level our mental perspectives of different relationships if we want to see them as they truly are. We have to pull dating, marriage, and family down a few pegs in our mind if we're going to see the true value of all of the relational states we're gifted by God. We will not see the goodness of singleness until we level our mental playing field of different relationships. And once we do this, we can see our different relationships as they really are, as reflections of God's love and mediums through which we experience the facets of God's abundant and flourishing love for us. Through this change in how we can value singleness, we can start to view it in two new ways, as our gospel message and as our vocation. When we look at singleness as a gospel message, we see that singleness points us towards the breadth and fullness of God's love. Single life is not intended to be a lonely life, but a life that is especially connected to the community of God. In community, there is a variety and beauty in the different relationships that form there. In any other group, there is some sort of shared interest or history that binds people together, like a shared hobby or nationality or social status or something else. The community of God is different in that while there might be shared interests in history, the true thing that binds us is a shared love of Christ, of knowing that we are each broken and yet redeemed in love by God. This is so powerful because done right, it cuts across all other ties and it brings people in a community that otherwise would have no logical reason to be together. Now all of us can come to the Father through the same Holy Spirit because of what Christ has done for us. Singleness points to the breadth of God's love and that singleness offers the most opportunities for friendships and forming new relationships. Of course, in dating or in marriage, you continue to have friends and to meet new people, but that time starts to look different because it becomes more focused in on one or just a few people. For me, a lot of my time goes to building up my marriage with Tyler, and I prioritize this over many of my other relationships. But before I was married or before I was dating, all of my relational time was spent with my friends, getting coffee or going hiking or studying together, or trying to go see the One Direction movie, but instead having to fix an overheating car for like 3 hours. Those are the things that build up friendships. But just as God is able to love and care for many people in a variety of ways, singleness offers the space to build up a variety of relationships in community. These relationships encourage us, they support us, they teach us, and they reflect the love of God for each and every one of us. Jesus told his disciples that their love for each other would prove to the world that they were true followers of Christ. And we can do the same thing by our ability to love others well. We can build up relationships that cut across the superficial borders the world puts in place, proving God the breadth of God's love for the world. At the same time, singleness reflects the fullness of God's love because it shows that we are complete without a romantic partner. We're not unformed or incomplete without a significant other in our lives. We have been made whole by Christ, and we've been gifted the beauty of all kinds of relationships in the family of God. We seek God first, and we acknowledge that we don't need a boyfriend or girlfriend or a spouse to complete us. God is our true hope and fulfillment, and God provides generally for what we need. Paul puts it this way in Ephesians: I pray that from his glorious, unlimited resources, he will empower you with inner strength from through his Spirit. Then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust in him. Your roots will grow down into God's love and keep you strong. And may you have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, and how deep his love is. May you experience the love of Christ, though it is too great to understand fully. Then you will be made complete with all the fullness of life and power that comes from God. Many of us have been told that singleness means that something is missing, but through the love of Christ, we are made complete with the fullness of God. For each of us, single, dating, married, God has made us whole through Jesus and empowered us through the Spirit. And while this is true for everyone, singleness most fully showcases the completeness of God's love. There's no deficit there. There's nothing missing. God is present at home in our hearts and revealing the incredible breadth and depth and fullness of his love in each of us. Another person could not possibly make us complete, as only Christ in all of his perfection is able to truly fulfill us. Singleness reflects the fullness that only God can give and offers a testament to God's singular ability to make us whole and complete. And if we're committed to this view of singleness as a gospel message of the breadth and fullness of God's love for the world, then it follows that the lives of single people and their friends and communities around them should look different. To do this, we have to begin to view singleness as a vocation. A vocation is work, something that requires and is worthy of practice and dedication. If you are single, then living well as a single person can be viewed as your vocation. This isn't to say that it's your all-consuming activity, but cultivating a healthy, flourishing singleness is something that requires attention and intentionality. So what can a single person do to practically live this out? First, practice contentment. Don't live as if the only thing to live for was to be dating someone or to be married. That's no way to live, and it robs you of the fullness and joy that God offers in your life right now. Your life is worth so much more than that. Contentment frees us to enjoy what we are given right now and not to be trapped in a state of never enough. I've often heard the lie from single people that they would be content if they just had a boyfriend or girlfriend, or if they were just married. That's not contentment. The reality is that contentment is not tied to any external circumstance, but to our heart condition. Paul explains contentment this way to the Philippians: "Not that I was ever in need, for I have learned how to be content with whatever I have. I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I have learned the secret of living in every situation, whether it is with a full stomach or empty, with plenty or little, for I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength." Because contentment is based on our internal perspective rather than on our external circumstance, we cannot expect that dating someone or getting married is suddenly going to make us content. It might push off the feelings of discontent for a while, but with time, that feeling of lack will just creep it back into our lives. You may think, well, I'll be content and I'll be happy when I get married. But that will turn into, well, I'll be content when we get a house, or I'll be content when we have children, or I'll be content when that person changes into exactly who I would like them to be. It will become a never-ending cycle where nothing ever, ever satisfies, no matter how good the present situation is. Learning true contentment, being able to rest in God's love and trust that God cares for you and will give you what you need, is a skill that will free you from the lies and discontent of this world. I was reading a book recently that framed this idea as the given good and the expected good, and learning to appreciate and value the good thing that has been given to you, rather than grasping after the good thing you expected or desired. Learn to see the given good in your life, the gifts of the particular circumstance God has placed you in, rather than allowing the lack of the expected good to steal your joy. It's not bad to want a relationship or to want to be married, but it is not something that should diminish your ability to enjoy the good things in your life right now. And second, it's important to practice good self-care. Do things for yourself that refresh you, that fill you with joy, that push you to try new things and experiences. Care for your relationship with God, protecting time to spend resting in God's love and learning more about God's character in Scripture. Figure out what you're good at and what you're passionate about, and seek interests and experiences that connect those gifting and passions. When I was single, I did struggle with loneliness and feeling like I was lacking, but I think this was the area that really helped me to experience singleness positively. While I was single in college, I traveled, I tried playing guitar badly, but I tried. I interned with DR and served others. I worked like a whole bunch of different jobs, one of which actually led to the job I have now. I spent quality time with my friends and my roommates. And all of this helped me to see that my life was full and joyful, whether or not I was dating someone. Good self-care also means digging into your emotional and spiritual health and taking the steps you need to become a healthier person. Caring for yourself well often means doing things that you might think are uncomfortable or working through parts of your past that are painful. For me, I had to spend some serious, intentional time during my junior and senior years of college to work through some deep hurts I had around my family history and my struggles with anxiety. I went to counseling, I learned more about emotional health and the ways that I really needed to grow, and I worked with friends and mentors to learn to become more vulnerable and more aware of my emotions. It was hard, painful work at times, but it was necessary if I was to grow and be able to love myself and love others more fully. This time spent healing and opening myself up to God and to others was so valuable in beginning to see my full worth as someone loved by God. You are valuable and worth caring for whether or not you're in a relationship. Do the things you need to truly care for yourself and to grow where you need to. Third, practice deep relationships and hospitality. Find others to connect with and take the time to really build those relationships up. Commit to going to a small group weekly or to meeting up with a friend on a regular basis to get coffee. I've met up with Becky and Savannah almost every week for the past 4.5 years. And that amount of regular and intentional time together has led to deep friendships that I am incredibly grateful for. And we've been able to share our lives together through difficult decisions, through really tough weeks, through job changes, through relationships, and everything in between. You can also find a hobby and use that as a way to spend quality time with others. For example, for the past several years, Katie and I have tried to hike together, at least semi-regularly. And that time spent out in the beautiful mountains and canyons around Tucson, experiencing nature and sharing our lives together have been some of my favorite parts of our friendship. Over time, Peyton has also joined our hiking squad, and getting to know him better and spend that time together has also been really awesome. And I love that we've been able to share that together for the past few years. A healthy singleness does not mean a life devoid of others. In fact, it's critical to intentionally invest your time and energy into quality friendships. Share your life with others and learn to care for and support your friends and be cared for and supported in return. Practicing hospitality is one way to do this. Opening up your space to others and finding ways to both tangibly care for your friends and to let them know that you love them and appreciate them. It doesn't need to be something elaborate. Something as simple as inviting a friend over to watch a movie or to cook dinner together can go a long way to showing that you care for them and you value them and build up that friendship. And finally, I want to share some practical steps for those of us who are not single, because how we talk about singleness and treat our single friends has a huge effect on how singleness is valued in our community. Do not further the lie our culture has given us that singleness is a lesser status than being in a relationship. That's just not true. Our value is not based on our relational status, and singleness is not something to try and fix or explain away. We have to uplift and encourage our single friends because they are loved, and valuable, and complete right now. And practically speaking, one way we can do this is to respect the time and energy of single people in our lives. It's easy to slip into thinking that a single person's time is less valuable because it's not being spent with a spouse or with children. Of course they have time to tear down after church or do all the other events, because what else will they be doing? That view is not helpful. And it does not respect the time and energy of our friends. Someone who's single doesn't have the same responsibilities to a spouse or significant other, but they still have commitments and relationships that require their best, their time and their energy and their intention. And those things are just as important. Rather than assuming that all the people who aren't dating or married have all this extra time to take care of cleaning up after events or taking care of other tasks that we may not want to do, we have to respect the time of single people and the need for them to invest in quality relationships and experiences of their own. Check in with your single friends and don't make assumptions about their time or ability to do things based on their singleness. In this way, we can create a culture that values singleness just as much as any other relational status. And earlier I mentioned that one of the things I did a fair amount as a single person in college was travel. In between my freshman and sophomore year, I was able to travel to Europe for about 5 weeks, which was a super cool opportunity, and I really appreciated it. Most of that trip I was with friends, but while I was there, I decided to take a trip to London by myself because I could, for a couple of days while I was abroad. I was not anticipating this being very difficult because I actually knew the language, like for once, and I should theoretically be able to get around a place where everyone else spoke English with like minimal trouble. Guys, I was wrong. After an all-night bus ride, a sudden allergy attack out of nowhere, and forgetting to eat for like hours, I found myself lost in the middle of an enormous city I had never been in without the lifeline that is my cell phone and minimal emotional resources to start figuring stuff out. I had a sudden existential crisis in a coffee shop about how I was going to be able to function on my own. What if this was how it always was, just trying to figure stuff out by myself, feeling alone and panicky and exhausted? I ended up spending a couple of hours just journaling, writing out all these fears and frustrations about being alone that I didn't even know I had. But getting that out into the open with myself and with God allowed me to see where I hadn't been seeing the whole picture. I wasn't alone. Maybe I was on my own for that trip and that day, but I had friends there and back home who cared about me. I wasn't helpless. I was just lost for the moment, and I would figure out what I needed to do, or I would ask someone to help me. My life wasn't worse because I wasn't dating someone. My life was full of adventure and promise and experiences that I was excited for. I had been told by our culture that I was lacking or somehow missing out, but I saw that that just wasn't true. I might not have been able to articulate it then, but God was shifting how I saw my own singleness from something that was burdensome and painful to something that was good and hopeful. And when we shift our view of what singleness means, when we learn to view it not as a state of being not enough or as a problem to be fixed, we are able both to live better lives as single people and to love and care for our single friends better. Our relational status is not our worth or our identity, but a particular context God has placed us in to reveal the love of Christ to the world. Before anything else, we are loved by God, and we are made whole and redeemed out of the sacrifice and love of Christ. Our lives should reflect that love, and the relational context God has given us is our space to be that reflection. We don't need to be absorbed by trying to get from one relational status to another, but instead see the goodness of where we are right now. Author and teacher Paige Benton Brown writes this about her own singleness. I am single because God is so abundantly good to me, because this is his best for me. Let us see God's best for us in whatever relational place we find ourselves in now. Because God is so abundantly good to us, because this is God's best for us, because God loved us first.